inaugural speaker series event hosted by the newly formed Center for Archival Futures at the iSchool. I'm Jason Barron. I'm delighted to be a new faculty member at the iSchool. The aim of the center is to advance knowledge and practice by serving as an active hub, bringing together researchers, professionals, and students to facilitate collaborative research projects involving the use of and care for digital objects and data over time. I would like to acknowledge Brian Butler, professor and senior associate dean here at the iSchool, who has spearheaded the formation of the center, and in doing so has assembled a terrific group of faculty to help shape the activities of the center as it goes forward. I also wish to acknowledge Beth Domingo, the coordinator of the Cafe Speaker Series, who facilitated today's event. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and former colleague, Gary M. Stern, General Counsel of the National Archives and Records Administration. I know Gary's bio was provided in the flyer for this event, but let me give my own personal version of someone who I worked with closely for 13 years and have boundless admiration for. After graduating from Yale Law School, Gary worked as an attorney for the ACLU, where he became a subject matter expert in information law and national security issues. As I am sure Gary will tell you during the talk today, he went on to become a named plaintiff in the landmark lawsuit Armstrong v. Executive Office of the President, the lawsuit that preserved Iran-Contra backup tapes that were going to be destroyed on the last day of the Reagan administration. That lawsuit changed the course of governmental policies on preserving electronic records. He went on to work at the US Department of Energy, where he was a senior advisor to the Secretary of Energy, in doing so, he worked as a senior policy and research analyst for the US Federal Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. Since 1998, Gary has been General Counsel of the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, as a career member of the Senior Executive Service. In his 22 years as General Counsel, Gary has had a high-level seat and has actively participated in the last 4 presidential transitions. He also plays an important role on providing advice to all of the presidential libraries in the NARA system. Let me just say one more thing. Everyone who has had the privilege of working with Gary knows that he is the consummate professional civil servant. He has always acted in a nonpartisan manner, demonstrating impeccable judgment in providing legal advice for decades to a series of archivists of the United States, as well as to White House lawyers. Gary will be talking to us today on the subject of presidential transitions and presidential libraries, past, present, and future. I would urge people to feel free to send in questions via chat during the talk. And then at the end, there'll be an opportunity for all of us to ask questions directly to Gary. So Gary, welcome. The Zoom floor is yours. Gary, we can't hear you.
The classic Zoom mistake. I was on mute. Sorry about that. But I want to first off thank you, Jason, for that very nice introduction, which does reflect our long time working together as colleagues and close friends. After, of course, we were opposing each other in active litigation involving that very Armstrong case that you mentioned. And I want to thank as well Beth and the iSchool for inviting me here. And I'm privileged to be your inaugural speaker of your new series. So I really appreciate it. I know this, we came up with the title of the talk, and but you know, we could also have simply titled it Everything You Always Want to Know About Presidential Records, but Never Thought to Ask. So I'm going to do my best in the course of the next hour just to walk everyone through the world of presidential records, which of course includes then how we manage those records in our presidential library system. but I thought it might make sense just to start with the present before going back to the past, and then we can even look forward a little bit. The present, which is really the immediate past present, is the Trump transition that we've just at one level completed, which is to say that, and we've completed the easy part, and that's to say that under the Presidential Records Act, which is the special law that governs and controls just the records of the White House, the president, and his close advisors, makes transitions really easy because by simple operation of law, the moment the president leaves office, all presidential records are transferred from the president and White House's legal custody into NARA's legal custody. So at 12:01 on January 20th, a week and a half ago, NARA assumed legal custody of all Trump presidential records. We didn't have to do anything; it just happens, and all Trump records belong to us now. Coupled with that, of course, is the hard part, which is what we call the physical move, the actual move of the records out of the White House complex, and the White House data centers, most importantly these days, into NARA's physical custody and control, so that we actually have direct access to those records. And that, I have to say, is still a work in progress. I think by the end of this week, we will have virtually all of the what we call traditional textual records, the paper and the gifts, and all the physical objects and records that exist in the White House. We should have all those in our custody in our buildings by the end of this week. That, though, which used to be almost the sum total of a presidential transition, is now really just a tiny portion. Probably at this point, certainly less than 5%, maybe even less than 1% of the volume of records are textual in nature. And nowadays, virtually all of the records are electronic, and the volumes keep increasing, both in numbers of files and then the size of those files. So we're now anticipating bringing in as many as 500 terabytes of Trump electronic records into our system and into our electronic records archives. And that is always a complex and rather time-consuming effort. We've had the luck and privilege, as long as I've been here until this administration, of having two-term presidents, which Jason noted, NARA is a completely non-partisan, non-political agency within the government. But we always like to say that we always prefer a two-term presidency for purposes of transition, because then we know, and everyone knows when the end is coming, and we can plan for it accordingly. But we always have to prepare for a one-term transition. And so, I work personally with several of my colleagues with the White House and the folks in the White House who manage the records, which starts with the counsel to the president, but then also the White House Records Management Office and the IT staff. And when we start working with them at the beginning of an administration, we make clear and tell them, remind them that, from our perspective, transition begins on their first day in office, because starting on the first day, they got to plan for the last day. And well, again, we and they most certainly would prefer a two-term presidency. We have to plan and prepare for a one-term. And that happened this time. Of course, we weren't certain it was going to happen until it happened. Of course, then we weren't certain. Some people, at least, weren't certain it happened even after it happened. But that meant we only had from election day in November to January 20th to, in the ideal world, complete the physical transfer. And the challenge with that is that even the last time we did a transition at the end of Obama's two terms, just 4 years ago, when the total volume of electronic records was roughly 250 terabytes, it took 6 months to do the physical transfer of the electronic records, which involves exporting the records out of their sort of live network and live system into, and then transforming them, reformatting them into the archival format that we need for our electronic records archives. And so we, as I've been saying now for quite a while, it's a 6-month project that we, technically should and would like to do in 2 months. And needless to say, it can't be done in this short time. So it's still ongoing, and it'll be a good while before we get all of the records, electronic records, into our physical custody and control. But they belong to us, and we work hand in hand with the White House IT professionals to make sure that transfer continues and is ongoing. But thinking about, this administration, the most recent transition, and how these transitions have evolved over time, I think maybe or seems like the first question on everyone's minds right now is, what about those tweets? Trump, for a large part, ran his government on Twitter using tweets, and so has now gotten all the tweets. And the short answer is we will, and that includes deleted tweets, revised tweets, and any other sort of messaging that occurred on his @RealDonaldTrump personal account, as well as @POTUS official account, and the numerous other accounts in the White House. It got a little complicated right at the end, of course, because as everyone knows, Twitter, froze his account, essentially blocked access to his account, and so the archiving system in place, therefore, wasn't able to do all the syncing that needed to be done. So we're still working on ensuring that we get all the tweets directly with and from Twitter. But that, of course, is just one relatively small place and piece of the electronic records of this administration. Now, one-term transitions, as I noted, are always going to be complicated. Fortunately for me, it's the first one I've had to do in my 22 years at the National Archives. Last one was Bush 41. I wasn't there in the White House, although some of my former colleagues were, and Jason, I think, was involved in that somewhat complicated transition when they were just beginning to deal with the challenge of transferring electronic records. I believe there's a quote and a reference to, the last day and the last morning of the White House having to pull hard drives and tossing them like Frisbees into boxes to make sure they're all removed from the White House and transferred into the custody of the National Archives. And it used to be that we and our staff would be in the White House, in those last weeks and last days and the last morning of an administration, making sure we get every last piece of paper, every last box packed and moved out. And indeed, I had sort of the interesting experience of being able to spend the morning, inauguration morning, in the White House complex between the transition from Bush 43 to Obama. It meant I had to sleep in the National Archives building downtown so I could be inside the security zone that morning, and got driven up by Secret Service from our building to the White House, and then made sure there was nothing we had to be concerned about happening at the last minute. It went very smoothly 12 years ago, but since then, we haven't haven't needed to be in the building to do the transition on the last day, because most of it's been wrapped up with respect to paper and files, and then all the electronic records are sitting outside the complex in the White House data center, and working with the IT folks to make sure we get those records transferred to us. So, the kind of the ultimate summary, and I know that lots of folks have, and in the press, want to make sure and want to know, how do we know if we've gotten everything? How do we know if there are gaps or, records have been deleted or removed or anything like that? And at one level, and this is true of all transitions, we only know, well, we can only know what we know, and we only get what is given to us. That's true of all transitions, which is the White House provides, is responsible and really exclusively and solely responsible for managing their records. And in the transition, it is, we are dependent on getting from them whatever they have to give to us, and that's all we can ultimately know for sure. And but we also do have insights and knowledge into how they have managed the records over the course of their administration, and we're able to have a pretty good sense of what should be coming and what we get, and ideally ways to make sure there are no gaps or things missing, which we can talk about and I will talk about in a few minutes. But finally, the last question that's been coming up a lot with this transition is, will there be a Trump presidential library? And at one level, again, that's an easy thing to answer. Yes, there already is a Trump presidential library. It's called Trump Presidential Library, or trumplibrary.gov, and it's on our website. It is the NARA virtual presidential library for the Trump records. And that's where we already are providing access to publicly available Trump records, like TrumpWhiteHouse.gov is accessible from that site. And we will continue to provide electronic records of the Trump administration on that site, including the tweets, and once we get full access to them, and other social media accounts and social media records that are already publicly available will be available at the Trump Presidential Library. And I'll also get into in just a few minutes the sort of the background on the traditional presidential library system, in which we have 13 official presidential library buildings. These are buildings that are built privately by the presidents and the former presidents after they leave office, and then donated to the National Archives for us to run and administer, where we put the records, where we have staff, where we have a research room, where we have a museum run by NARA. That system began with FDR, and the last sort of formal official presidential library was Bush 43, that is run and controlled by NARA. President Obama changed that model, and I will explain what he has done and is intending to do in a few minutes. But I thought it might make sense just to step back a little bit now and just give you sort of a very baseline history of the history of presidential papers and presidential records, kind of going all the way back to the beginning. And at some level, I'd like to think of from a timeline perspective. I think I have lost my connection.
We can hear you, Gary, but
oh, you can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see me?
you may have lost the video, but I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Because I lost the video, so so I can't tell if you can see me. But anyways, just I was about to say, from the world of presidential records and presidential papers, at one level can be divided into two time periods, which is before 1934 and after 1934, because 1934 was when the National Archives was created and founded. And before there was a National Archives, presidential papers could be, and in fact were, and
Now we can't hear you, but we can see you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, all right. So, sorry for technical difficulties. So before 1934, presidential papers from George Washington through FDR were haphazardly managed and maintained. I have a sign here saying my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully this doesn't happen again. Actually, I was going to note that for a pretty good, or at least a kind of ad hoc history of where papers were located and how they were managed, the most recent piece I've seen is in the New Yorker back in November. Jill Lepore did an article about the presidential records and presidential papers, and so she gives a good background that folks can look at. But under FDR in 1934, the National Archives Act was passed, and the National Archives was created, and which is to be the place where all the permanent records of the U.S. government could be centrally maintained. And our building downtown, a beautiful old classic building, was being constructed at the time. And that served as the place for all the government agency records, the permanent records, to come to. But presidential papers were, on their own until FDR took it upon himself to commit to donating his papers to the National Archives as the repository for presidential papers. And he went one step further. He said, I'm going to build a building, calling it a presidential library, on his estate in Hyde Park, New York, and donate the building along with the papers and a museum, so we could, all to the National Archives, who could have a research facility and a museum experience for the public to see and have access to the records of his presidency. And when he did that, his immediate predecessor, President Hoover, said, that's a good idea. I want to do the same thing. And after him, every president followed suit. But, and this is important clarification, is those papers, starting with President Washington and all the way through President Carter, were considered the personal property of the president. They were not government property, government records. Presidents could do whatever they wanted and with them. And it wasn't until FDR that they were formally and officially donated to the National Archives. But they were donated and at their discretion. And so that process continued relatively unabated until 1974 with the resignation of President Nixon. And in connection, I just want to make a quick sidestep to the Federal Records Act of 1950. In 1950, Congress passed the statute that created a formal governance of all government records with 4 important exclusions or exemptions that were not covered by the government record law at the time, the Federal Records Act. And those were the records of Congress, the records of the Supreme Court, and the records of the architect of the Capitol, and the records of the president. All 4 of those categories of records were not governed by the FRA or any statute establishing them as formally as government property. And that becomes an important factor when Nixon leaves office in 1974, facing impeachment and in the context of the Watergate scandal, and ultimately arranges or begins the process of considering the donation of his papers to a National Archives presidential library that he might decide to build, but most significantly decided he was not going to donate the famous, infamous Watergate tapes, and would intended to destroy them because he could, because they were his personal property. And that's when, in 1974, Congress stepped in, passed a special statute called the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act, and seized that personal property, those presidential papers and recordings of Nixon, seized them from him and took them over as government property and deposited them in the National Archives. That was in 1974. The first act was the seizing and taking over of all those papers and recordings. The second act set up a special National Study Commission to look into this whole unusual circumstance of papers of presidents and the Supreme Court and the Congress not being government property, and asked this commission to look into and make recommendations on what should be done in the future. And that commission ultimately recommended that there should be a new law that establishes presidential, congressional, Supreme Court materials, papers, and all as government records. But in 1978, Congress took it upon itself only to pass the Presidential Records Act, not a Congressional or Supreme Court Records Act, and such that that started the new era of formal government presidential records, beginning with the next president to take office, and that's President Reagan. So there's a kind of quick background of how records, presidential records, came formally into government control, and that's the law that I mentioned earlier, under which we, the National Archives, automatically, under the Presidential Records Act, take legal custody when the president leaves office, and that's what we have just done. And so since 1980, we have operated under that law, and first president was Reagan, two-term president, and as his administration was coming to an end, the sort of process of doing a transition and transferring the records from the White House to the National Archives was underway. And that's when, as Jason mentioned, I worked for the ACLU, and I recall quite distinctly, I guess that would be 31 years ago, in January 18th, 1989, getting approached by journalist Scott Armstrong, who then was the founder and director of the National Security Archive, coming to us at the ACLU saying, we've just learned that the White House is planning to delete and destroy all of the White House emails in the complex, which back then were called Cross Notes, and the first White House email system, and government email system, I believe, being used at the time, which were famously at issue in the Iran-Contra scandal of the time. But their plan was to destroy all the electronic emails, and under the view at the time that, well, the paper, all the records would have been printed and filed in paper folders, and nothing, the electronic version of those records had no official, legal, and archival value, and didn't need to be maintained. And that's when, along with Scott Armstrong, I joined the lawsuit and stayed up all night on January 18th, and we filed a temporary restraining order the morning of January 19th to stop that destruction of the electronic emails known as Prof Notes. The White House and the Department of Justice came into court that morning, represented by then head of the Civil Division, John Bolton, and arguing that, no, these aren't records. The emails are really just like Post-it notes or telephone message slips. They're not records in and of themselves, and they don't need to be preserved. Fortunately, we convinced the judge that was not the best position to take, and he issued the TRO, and they had to sort of shut down the whole White House electronic system in order to preserve the emails on backup tapes, on the last day of the Reagan administration before President Bush was taking over. And that began the famous Armstrong litigation that Jason Barron, your professor, was the lead counsel for the government for many years after, in helping to figure out how the government can best manage electronic records going forward. And so ever since then, the case was ultimately settled. It took maybe 6 years until the Clinton administration to resolve that case and make it and officially agree that it would preserve all emails in their electronic format going forward as official records of the White House. And but at the same time, it also required the Bush administration to restore the emails from the backup tapes that they had been maintaining for many years, and what was not, what I guess is, as the title or the intro reference, the many controversies I've been involved in. The first was this case leading to a multi-million-dollar backup tape restoration project at the end of the Bush 41 administration that the White House had to undertake to get back all of the potentially missing emails. And lo and behold, at the end of the Clinton administration, that was the first transition I worked on. Turned out they had multiple technical difficulties with that email system, and led to their having to undertake a multi-million-dollar backup tape restoration project to restore missing emails at the end of the Clinton administration, which went and wasn't completed until well into the next incoming Bush administration. And then many of you may even remember back in 2007 or so, front page story about 5 million missing Bush White House emails, and which resulted from technical problems they had as they were changing email systems, and led to yet another multi-million-dollar backup tape restoration project at the end of the Bush 43 administration, which carried over well into the Obama administration. So that's kind of the litany of technical problems that have and can and do occur in this world of presidential records. And I won't even mention the Sandy Berger episode that we had to deal with during the course of the Bush administration. Save that one for another day. So as we're coming to, I want to leave time for questions and further discussion. I want to swing back to the what I mentioned earlier, the sort of potential change in the model of presidential libraries. When Obama left office, we thought, and I think he thought he would be doing what all his predecessors had done, building a presidential library that he would give to the National Archives to run, to house and hold the records, and a staff of National Archives employees, and a museum that we would run. But shortly after he left office, he rethought what he wanted to do, given that we had just transitioned 250 terabytes containing over 300 million emails. Each email averages about 5 pages, so we're talking 1.5 billion pages of email records and millions of other files, along with roughly 30 million pages of paper records, which is, in comparison, a tiny subset of the volume of records. President Obama decided, for a number of reasons, that maybe it didn't make sense for him to build a presidential library to give to the National Archives. Instead, he ventured in a different direction. He's still planning to build a private presidential center in Chicago with its own museum that he will run independently and privately, being run by his foundation. And instead, he committed to essentially funding a digitization effort to digitize those 30 million pages of paper records so that in effect, NARA's Obama Presidential Library would be a 100% virtual library. And so he sort of took this different approach, and given the, as I mentioned, even with Trump, given that probably close to 99% of the records are electronic, I think we're expecting maybe 10 million pages of paper records and over 200 million emails, totaling probably at least 1 billion pages of emails. It's quite likely that that's going to be that President Trump could follow the same model. So that's where the future of presidential libraries may be going. And then the question is, what about the future of presidential records? The Presidential Records Act of 1978 was amended in 2014 and established a couple of key and important new provisions, including the issue of how to deal with folks who use personal email, personal Twitter accounts, any personal messaging accounts, and trying to ensure that if they use those for official business, they're properly captured in official government systems. A new bill was introduced at the end of the last Congress by Senator Murphy to consider further amendments to the Presidential Records Act, and folks should look at that and we'll see if that's reintroduced and what if any other changes come up. And in the meantime, I think, from the National Archives perspective, our goal is to essentially move entirely into the digital world and, transform the National Archives into a digital archives. Certainly going forward, we've already established for federal agencies and records that essentially after 2022, we don't intend to accept any paper records anymore. It should be all digital. And given the trends of presidential records, that would, be our ideal goal, that essentially in the future, all presidential records are digital. So that's my quick summary and background. And I look forward to any questions, Jason, that you may have and that the speakers may have. And I'll take it from there.
Great, Gary. I as you know, you could predict my first question, which is you are taking in an enormous volume of presidential records in all kinds of forms, electronically. Email is huge, and then there's a whole beyond email. And the government, as you just said, is poised as of 2022 with NARA policy to basically NARA going paperless, that it's, except for some legacy elements, going forward, it's going to be all digital objects and that are records. And so the question is, with this vast accumulation, will anybody be able to walk into the National Archives or click on the National Archives site and see any of this stuff? How does the public access the electronic and the digital world? Because from 1930 on, people could walk into an archives and ask for boxes of records and they can see them, but we can't see these objects unless there's some process. So speak to that looming issue.
Well, I mean, that's a fine and fair question, which is, how does anyone get access to presidential records nowadays? And it's true, even at the libraries like the Clinton Library and the Bush Library that, you know, where they have boxes of records and a research room. To get access to records in the first place, someone has to file a FOIA request. And most importantly, and in fact, we're getting press questions right now about, you know, how does folks get access to certain Trump records? There's a 5-year hiatus before the public can start making requests for presidential records. So even today, there's no public access to Obama records. You got 1 more year. You have to wait until January 20th of next year to make requests, make Freedom of Information Act requests for Obama records. And once that starts happening, we will provide access to the requester electronically, and then our intent will be to post those records that have been opened and are now available to the public also electronically on the Obama Library website for Obama records, linked to the National Archives catalog, which is the central repository that we have for access to all of our electronic records. So yes, it will be different than going to an older and more traditional library. And if you read Robert Caro, you know, the great and famous biographer of Lyndon Johnson, he talks about how he, you know, his number 1 mantra was turn every page, look at every page in the box, you know, because you never know what you might come upon. It's going to be different, and it is already different doing research in for more recent and modern records that are born digital and that are accessed digitally. You don't have that same experience.
It is a very big challenge. Let me not ask all the questions, although I have many here. If others wish to ask, I invite them to unmute yourself and speak up. There is one question that's been asked in the chat that let me try to read. How significant is NARA's decision to collect President Trump's personal account in addition to his POTUS account, I guess, on Twitter? Is this a departure from what was done at the end of the Obama administration when, with respect to President Obama's accounts, is NARA prepared to defend this if legally challenged? I'm not sure what challenge there would be for over-preservation, but in any event, is that a departure in terms of grabbing a personal account?
Well, let's start with who makes this decision. So President Trump made the decision to conduct official policy on his personal account. President Obama had the @POTUS account, which has been preserved as @POTUS44 Twitter account, which we do make available on the Obama Library website. And to the extent he might have had a personal account, I'm not aware that he engaged in any official business and therefore created presidential records in his personal account. President Trump did do that. He decided to do that. He did it his first day in office. And by the second day in office, he'd already deleted some tweets off of @RealDonaldTrump. Trump. And so we started getting questions immediately. Well, aren't those presidential records? Doesn't that violate the Presidential Records Act? We engaged, as we normally would, with the Trump White House counsel to talk about that, and they agreed that they are presidential records. And since he's using this account to create and even receive presidential records through comments and retweets and all of that, that they would manage, the White House would manage all of the records on that account as presidential records, all of the tweets on his personal account as presidential records from day one, and that they would preserve the deleted tweets and all the related record information that's on a Twitter, that would be on that Twitter account as presidential records. So it wasn't NARA ourselves actually making the decision. It was the White House who made that decision, and the president himself, by creating presidential records on that account. He had no choice under the law but to manage them that way, and it was understood and agreed that that account for the time he was president, from January 20th of 2017 until it was shut down on, I think, January 8th of this year, everything on that account would be treated as presidential records. So that's, the White House made that decision, and then we have worked to ensure that we actually receive all the records on that account.
Okay, so David Cecilia, why don't you go for it for a question?
Hey, thank you very much for a really useful presentation, Dr. Stern. I found encouraging your stories from, I guess, 1980 forward of instances when an administration either blocked or deleted records and you were able to get them restored, I believe you said, from the tape backups. So if you'll indulge with me, we'll call it a hypothetical. Suppose we have a bad actor among a former president who feels like he has a lot to hide or has a record of resisting the record keeping about meetings with Vladimir Putin, that kind of thing. Would it be possible for someone in either the Trump administration or theoretically any administration to get at those tape backups and delete those too? How confident are you that you would be able to detect that kind of thing in the first place, and you would be able to restore those intentionally deleted records? Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and in fact, if you go back to the first PRA controversy that we mentioned, the Iran-Contra scandal, which took place within the White House, principally the National Security Council, officials surreptitiously trading arms for hostages and all, and violating statutes and such. And when that got exposed to the public, some of you may recall that the supposed bad actors like Oliver North and John Poindexter were immediately started deleting their emails, their prof notes on that NSC classified email system. And apparently they spent hours trying to delete all of them. The key was they tried, because it turned out unknown to them, and actually I believe little known to most people in the White House, is like, well, just because you delete, I mean, now it should be known to everybody, just because you delete an email off of, your presentation on your computer doesn't mean it doesn't exist somewhere else, not only on a backup tape, but on the kind of central nerve system of the system. And so most all of those deleted prof notes were recovered at the time. And that, I think, is emblematic of how difficult it is to intentionally delete electronic records in an improper manner. And so ultimately, a couple of things. And you asked if, how could we, i.e. the National Archives, ensure against a bad actor in the White House. We actually can't do anything about it. Because we have no direct role in how the incumbent current president manages their records. That's entirely on them and the sort of White House office and their information technology support system, and the professionals who run the IT systems in the White House are solely and exclusively responsible for managing those systems. But I think it would be hard for any individual bad actor to be able to intentionally delete records, which would be a clear violation of law, including, if they're intentionally doing it, it could be a criminal act, to have to essentially have a whole conspiracy of a group of co-conspirators who would in the, including the professional IT staff that run the systems over there, to be able to get at the automated systems that are in place that automatically capture and archive all the emails, for example, and virtually all the other records, get them, off of their live system, off of the backup archival system, and off of the backup tape system where they are kept. I think it would, it seems to me it'd be exceptionally hard to do that.
I have a question. I don't know if they have the hand raised or not. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a historian, and so I've used NARA considerably. Wonderful place. And I have two quick questions. One was about when you talked about the architect of the Capitol records not being open. Is that, as we could link it to January 6th? In other words, we don't want to know where the secret rooms are. Is that part of the intent with that, or not related at all?
Well, so what I said is the architect of the Capitol is excluded or not covered by the Federal Records Act. So their records are not governed by the Federal Records Act that otherwise govern all other agencies, federal agencies in all three branches. I mean, that's the law that we oversee and administer applies to all three branches. One of the few laws that do. Congress usually passes laws that only apply to the executive branch, but the FRA applies to all three branches, but excludes, those four particular elements. And in a sense, the Congress and members of Congress and the Supreme Court, and the president, they're like the heads of each branch, can understand why they excluded themselves. I've never fully understood the background and history as to why the architect of the Capitol was excluded from the official record keeping requirements of the FRA. That does not necessarily mean they don't manage and preserve their records, and it's quite possible many of their records are open and available, but you for example wouldn't have a legal right of access like under the Freedom of Information Act or any other access statute to request them from that office, and it's really under their discretion and control how they manage their records in that that part of the Capitol.
Okay.
I believe Ellen Goodman has a question. You
Sorry.
need to unmute.
Yes. So I was wondering, I guess many things, but the two main things are two separate questions. If you're not collecting physical records anymore, what happens to them? Are they just shredded like any other kind of companies? Boxes of records. I mean, is the original signature the original piece of paper that was like the official whatever? Is that still I guess it's not useful anymore. And as I'm taking the archiving class at the moment and learning that electronic records are easily changed and physical records are not, and they always want the unique or whatever, authentic, whatever it is. So I'm just wondering
Sure.
what happens to the physical paper.
So couple of things. It depends on the context. So for example, in the White House, as I've already noted, most of the records are only in a digital form. So of course we only take them digitally. To the extent there's paper, paper presidential records, we always take those, and we always would take those. Even if there's a digital copy, we would want the paper also. But in federal agencies, it is the intended policy and practice going forward that, we sort of have a formal OMB memo, setting the beginning in the century, 2023 is when we'll stop taking in paper. The expectation is, again, that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, will already be born digital and be, exist, sort of officially and only in electronic form. To the extent there is paper, then it is our expectation that the paper should be digitized, and we want the digital copy and not the paper. We've just issued proposed regulation in the code of or in the Federal Register for public comment, the standards, the digitization standards that we expect agencies to meet when they are digitizing permanent records. And the other important thing to remember, and the difference between the FRA and the PRA, in the Federal Records Act world, the vast majority of records don't come into the National Archives. You know, we estimate only less than 5% of records created by government agencies are permanent for transfer into the National Archives. 95% of records are considered temporary and eventually get thrown away. And so it's really the agency's responsibility how they want to manage and maintain those records, whether they still want to have millions of boxes in the massive Federal Records Centers storage facilities that we have, or want to digitize those and digitize with the purpose of disposing of the paper. But in all those policies, there can be exceptions where the paper has intrinsic value, is of greater importance, and, including essentially wet signatures or all of the president and of, senior advisors and all of it, and treaties and certain, ceremonial documents and other type documents that might, for which the original paper might be appropriate for preservation.
Let
The
me,
presumption is going forward is everything in the federal agencies should presume to be electronic.
Let me ask you, Gary. There's been some question on the chat, and I certainly would like to know. We have all been through a rather shocking event on January 6th, and there's questions about whether any transcripts of presidential remarks or videos that were taken that day, are they going to end up at the National Archives? One route that I could see is evidence gathered for law enforcement purposes, including at the FBI, would be records of the FBI that might eventually get to the National Archives. But let's do it in two parts. One, transcriptions of presidential remarks first, and then other evidence that was seized that day.
Well, so certainly the records, created, received by the president while, on that day, like every and any other record that he created or received in the course of his presidency, should be preserved, and they should be coming to us if we don't already have them. And there's a longstanding practice of, all of the president's public remarks are maintained, preserved. Those are publicly made available through what used to be the weekly compilation of presidential activities. I think it's now become the daily compilation, and so that, but whatever official transcript was made of that should be, and I expect we will have those for what he did. For what occurred elsewhere, what occurred at the Capitol, as the prior question was just asking about, essentially to the extent that the Capitol and folks on the Capitol were creating records, and including videos and all of that, those would be congressional records or records of the archive of the Capitol. They we would not expect those to come into NARA's legal custody and control, although we do serve, NARA still serves as the sort of archival repository of the records of Congress, and ultimately make available the records of Congress and the records of the Supreme Court. You can still find them in the National Archives. The key difference is they don't come into our legal custody. They're still controlled by Congress or the court. They just use our services to make them available in our research rooms and all that.
Well, we're at just near the top of the hour, and I want to turn this back over to Beth. But Gary, thank you so much for this journey that you've taken and told us about through a number of presidential administrations, and you're still in the job. So good luck going forward, both with the rest of this transition and whatever records from the Biden administration and issues that come up. So thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Well, thanks again for having me, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope it was useful to all of you.